All right, so 1 Samuel 16 and 17. Now we finally get to meet the one we've been looking for the whole book so far. We're looking for David. David is finally introduced here in chapter 16. But remember where we've come from. Israel did not have a king at the beginning of the book. They wanted a king like the nations, and they got a king like the nations. And we've followed this journey of Saul, and it's been up a little bit and mostly down. Most of the time Saul has not done very well. Last time we were together, we saw that the Lord officially removed Saul. He said, your family will not continue in the kingdom. You're going to be removed from that kingship. And it was a very sad day in Israel because the Lord has rejected Saul. And right at the end of that, you remember that Samuel was grieving over Saul in the same way that God was grieving over Saul. And that's important because we pick up in chapter 16 and the story just kind of continues. We have chapter divisions and verse divisions, and those are helpful, but sometimes it confuses us. And we see that Samuel is still grieving over Saul. So look at verse 1 there. It says, "The Lord said to Samuel, 'How long will you grieve over Saul, since I have rejected him from being king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and go. I will send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided for myself a king among his sons.'" So Samuel is still grieving over Saul, and the Lord says, look, it's over. Saul's days are over, even though he's going to continue until the end of the book. Until chapter 31, Saul is still alive, Saul is still on the throne, but he is not the right and proper king of Israel. The Lord has rejected him. So the time for grieving is over. I like the way one writer said, Saul's work for God has ended, but God's work goes on. And so now we're seeing God's story. The work of God will go on, and God is directing Samuel to Bethlehem, to the family of Jesse. And I love this phrase, "For I have provided for myself a king." That may sound familiar to you. That's language that we see in different parts of the Bible. We think about Abraham and Isaac in Genesis 22, and just as Abraham has the knife raised and he's ready to offer his son as a sacrifice, the Lord stops him. An angel of the Lord stops him, and it says God has provided for himself a lamb. And of course we know that God, in His righteous anger, He deserves a sacrifice, He deserves a substitute, and we could not do that, and God has provided for Himself the sacrifice, the substitute, Jesus Christ. Now, that's for free. You can preach that yourself. It's too early in the lesson for me to preach it. But you see it right there in verse 1. "I have provided for myself a king among the sons of Jesse." Now, Samuel hears this, and he knows what God is asking, but he also knows about Saul. Saul is not going to like this, not one little bit. And so Samuel says, how can I do this? How can I go? If Saul hears it, he will kill me. Saul is watching everything Samuel does. Samuel very possibly has more influence in the kingdom than even Saul himself does. So every move Samuel makes, Saul is watching. And if Samuel starts going somewhere different than his normal route, you remember he's got his little 3 cities that he goes and he rules as judge there in Israel. But if he starts going to a strange place, there are spies watching everywhere. Word's going to get back to Saul, and Saul is not going to like it one little bit. And if Saul hears that Samuel is going to anoint another king, what do you think is going to happen to that king and his family? It's not going to be good. What do you think is going to happen to Samuel if Saul hears about it? He's probably going to get killed too. It's starting to feel like The Godfather here. Everybody's going to start losing their heads. It's not going to be good. And so the Lord gives him instructions. He says, "Take a heifer with you and say, 'I have come to sacrifice to the Lord.'" Now, there's going to be other times in the book, but we get a little hint of it here where we wonder, wait a minute, is somebody lying? Is somebody that we're looking up to in the story telling the truth here? Because God has just said you're going to anoint somebody as the new king, and now God's saying, well, go and tell them that you're going to have a sacrifice to the Lord. Well, he's not lying because that's exactly what he does. He goes and he makes a sacrifice. And we see Samuel is doing exactly what God has told him to do. He's just not giving every bit of information. And there are times that for obedience to God's will and for the greater good, to protect evil from happening to others, sometimes you withhold a little bit of that information. Because if Samuel had told them all about a new king, then Saul certainly would have been very upset about that. So God gives him instructions, and he says, look, invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and then I will show you what you shall do. And you shall anoint him for me, whom I declare to you. Notice that God doesn't tell Samuel who is going to be anointed as the new king. He just says it's from the line of Jesse. It's one of his sons. You go, do what I'm telling you to do, and I will give you further instructions. And so Samuel does what the Lord commands him to do. He comes to Bethlehem, and the elders of the city of Bethlehem, they come to meet him trembling. Now, we're not told exactly why they're trembling, but just if you can remember from last time, why might they be a little upset at the sight of Samuel showing up in their town? He's the judge. So anytime the judge shows up, people get nervous. No offense, Russell. But do you remember what we saw Samuel doing at the end of chapter 15? He hacked Agag to pieces. And we talked about that, what visible language that is. It's very visual language. And so they probably heard about that and they think, oh no, who's next? What is going on? Samuel has come to town. And so they ask him, trembling, they say, do you come peaceably? He says, peaceably, I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Consecrate yourselves and come with me to the sacrifice. And specifically, he consecrates Jesse and his sons and invites them to the sacrifice. So they get cleaned up, they get prepared, he gets the whole family together, and they're going to the sacrifice. So now this means the family's all together, and Samuel starts looking at them. But remember, he's in an awkward position. He doesn't know exactly who God has in mind. So right now, Samuel has to use his own judgment, not the judgment of the Lord. And let's see, how does Samuel judge people? Well, first, he looks at Eliab, and he thinks, oh, that's got to be the one. Surely the Lord's anointed is before him. He looks at him, and we can tell from the context, Eliab must be a tall son. He's probably a strong son. He's probably a good-looking son. Does that sound like anybody else we've seen? Saul. Samuel was impressed with Saul just like everybody else was because he was taller. He was taller than everybody else, and he was impressive looking. He was good looking. He was handsome. And so Samuel is still using that same flawed logic. He looks at Eliab and he says, oh, this has got to be the one. Oh, but look at verse 7. The Lord said to Samuel, do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. Just like God had rejected Saul, he's rejecting Eliab. He's saying, for the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. Literally, man looks at the eyes, but God looks at the heart. Now, we've heard this verse. If you've been in church any length of time, you know this idea, and we know that's a good principle. We kind of think of it as don't judge a book by its cover. But there's a whole lot more going on here. First, he says, the Lord sees not as man sees. That's a reminder that God is not like us. He's altogether different than us. And this is one of those times where we could flip back to Hannah's prayer and we could be reminded in Hannah's prayer, 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 2, where she says, there is none holy like the Lord, for there is none beside you. Remember, Hannah's prayer is like a table of contents all throughout this book. We haven't looked at it every single week, but she gives us a preview, an overview of everything that we see in this book. The Lord is not like us. He doesn't look as the way man sees. Instead, man looks on the outside. He looks on the outer appearances, but the Lord looks on the heart. The Lord looks on the thoughts, the emotions, our intent. Only God can do that. Only God can actually see our thoughts, our hearts. Only God can judge our hearts. Do you have a comment?
Yes. I was just wondering, the rest of the verses, each person comes by and it's like a fashion show.
Uh-huh.
How did Jesse already have the knowledge, I guess,
to have his sons together?
He said, I'm concentrating you and your family.
Well, I think when Samuel comes to town, he invites Jesse and his sons. That's what at the end of verse 5, it just says he consecrates Jesse and his sons and invites them to the sacrifice. So Jesse doesn't know what's going on. He thinks, it's kind of...
My Bible says purification.
Yeah. So, and we don't have a specific verse that says this is what it means to be purified or consecrated, but we see examples of that. So, that's taking a bath. That's one example we'd see. That's always a good thing. Clean clothes. But it also refraining from any sexual intercourse during that time, any bodily fluids, all the things that would make somebody ceremonially unclean, which again we normally think of being for the priest and that sort of stuff. They're going to the sacrifice as well. So
it just seems weird that Jesse's sitting and says, okay.
Yep, he's bringing his son. Well, you can imagine he's starting with the oldest one. That's the way it works. You put the oldest one up first. Right? And you're right. So you keep going in verse 8 and following. Jesse just brings out the next son. He calls Abinadab and makes him pass before Samuel. And he says, nope, neither has the Lord chosen this one either. Verse 9, then Jesse made Shammah pass by, and he said, neither has the Lord chosen this one. And Jesse made 7 of his sons pass before Samuel. And Samuel said to Jesse, the Lord has not chosen these. 3 times back to back. Not this one, not this one, not this one. All 7 times. It says it 3 times in the verse, but he does it for all of the 7 sons. And remember, we've talked about, again, you could summarize the Old Testament all the way from the Garden of Eden when God promises that there's going to be a seed coming, there's going to be an offspring of the woman, and the rest of the Old Testament is one big, not this one, not this one, not this one, not this one. None of them are the seed that we're looking for. But in this particular story, none of these are the sons that we're looking for. And so Samuel's got a dilemma because he's heard God speak. And God has said it's going to be one of Jesse's sons. And now Jesse's sons have passed before him, and none of them are the one the Lord has chosen. And so, look at verse 11. What does Samuel do? He says, is this all of them? Do you have any more? Are all your sons here? And Jesse says, well, there remains the youngest. But look, he is keeping the sheep. Behold, he's keeping the sheep. Jesse didn't think it was important enough to invite the youngest one, the runt of the family. It wasn't necessary to bring him. He's out there working. He's 7th down or 8th down. There's 7 sons ahead of him. So there's really no reason to think that David is needed at this sacrifice. Now, it's a big honor for the family. It's like Billy Graham's come to town and invited you to come sit on the front row of the crusade, and they're all cleaned up. They're ready to go. But David, he's just still out there with the sheep. In fact, we're not even told his name at this point. And so Samuel says to him, go get him, send and get him, for we will not sit down till he comes here.
Now, what's the importance of that?
We're not going to sit. I think it's just because Samuel knows God has sent him here. He's looking for one of Jesse's sons, and there's got to be another one. If all these have marched forward, I like the way you describe it as a beauty pageant. It's a men's beauty review, and they're all walking forward, and none of them are measuring up. And Samuel says, oh no, there's got to be one more. We're not going to do anything. We're not going to sit down for the sacrifice until he comes.
He knows he's tending sheep, but he could be out under the days.
Oh yeah, he doesn't know how far away he is.
We got to stand here for 2 days.
Yep. He may just mean that we're not going to have the sacrifice until he gets here, but either way, yep, he is confident there's got to be another son.
What do you think that when they say that he's out there watching the sheep and the goats? Is that, to me, would be something like God is Lord of all good and bad. In other words, takes care of all good and bad. In other words, they mention goats. I don't know why. Most times it's always sheep.
Mine only says sheep.
What verse?
You know, I ain't got my Bible. What is this? The New Living Thought.
You got a pink one, Fred.
I forgot mine tonight.
That's not in the pink one.
Tending the sheep.
Okay, that's what I'm gonna get my Bible.
Look how little of praying is. No wonder.
I know it. I forgot my Bible.
Yeah. So with that being a paraphrase, that's not a true translation. They may have added that, but I don't see anywhere a translation that says sheep and goats. I don't think there's meant to be anything by that.
Because sheep and goats don't mix together to be tended.
Right. And so we're going to see a lot about David being a shepherd, but right now he's not here. He's out there. He's with the sheep right now. Yeah. No. We need to laugh. I can't make good jokes, so I need somebody to help me out. So Samuel says to Jesse, send him, get him here. We're not going to sit down until he comes. Verse 12, he sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy, he had beautiful eyes, and he was handsome. Now, ruddy could mean that he's either got red hair, or it could mean he spent a long time out in the sun tending the sheep, and he's got a bronze complexion. He's red-skinned. So either way, it's got something to do with the color red. He's got beautiful eyes, and he was handsome. Now, what should we make of that?
Saul was handsome, so were all the others. Not a good sign.
Well, maybe not a good sign. Well, more than anything, remember I'm going to remind you so many times tonight of verse 7. The Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. I'm going to keep pointing us back to that verse over and over and over.
Your outward appearance.
Yeah. So what does it mean, his physical appearance? Absolutely nothing. It's irrelevant. We have no way of knowing anything about it. We can understand why they wouldn't have looked at him because he's ruddy. Sometimes we get that idea that he's small or younger. We know he's the youngest, but really his appearance tells us nothing. What matters is that God sees the heart. And God has looked at David and says, this is the one. This is the one. Not in the big story of the Bible. He's just pointing us to the big one in the Bible. He's pointing us to Christ. But this is the one for this season. He is the King. Yes?
Then in the latter part of 12, somebody sat down. It says, rise and anoint him.
Uh-oh, look at that. Arise, anoint him, for this is he. Look at that. I hadn't even noticed that.
I hadn't either.
Arise and anoint him, for this is he. And so this is the one. God has made it clear, even though it wasn't what they were looking. This wasn't their based on outward appearances. It's not who they would have chosen. But God has chosen him. So Samuel takes the horn of oil, anoints him in the midst of his brothers. Now, oil in the Old Testament, and even in the New, symbolizes the presence of God, the Spirit of God coming upon someone. Here's a quote from a writer. As oil worked its way into the individual's hair and pores, they start at the top and pours down, it symbolizes the divine presence entering into the one being anointed. And so this is part of their coronation process. We saw this with Saul. There were several things related to that, but one of the things to anoint someone as king was to anoint him with oil. And something very important happens when Samuel anoints David with oil. It says, the Spirit of the Lord, the Spirit of Yahweh, rushes upon David from that day forward. Now, there's a couple things about that is from this day forward. Number one, that's better than Saul's anointing. God had anointed through Samuel. God had anointed Saul as king. But we're about to see in the very next verse, the Spirit of the Lord departs from Saul. And throughout the Old Testament, we see that that imparting the blessing of the Holy Spirit, the dwelling of the Holy Spirit, is temporary in the Old Testament. It's never promised that it will stay upon someone. Sometimes the Spirit of the Lord comes upon one of the judges. We've made reference to the book of Judges a lot in this study. And it's for a season. It's for a specific task. It's for a specific purpose. But here with David, it says from that day forward, he's indwelt. The Spirit of the Lord rushes upon David from that day forward. But even more than that, it points us to the New Testament, where we understand from Acts chapter 2 that every believer, from the moment they repent of their sins and trust Christ, they are indwelt by the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit doesn't come and go in the New Testament and throughout the Christian age the way that He did in the Old Testament. That's a critical difference. So sometimes Christians are looking for a second helping, a second blessing, all of that kind of language. The Bible doesn't tell us to look for that. We have the Holy Spirit dwelling in us. We can be filled with the Holy Spirit. When you look at the book of Acts, you see Peter and others being filled with the Holy Spirit. Normally, if you look really close, they've spent a lot of time in the Word. And they've spent time in the Word and in prayer. They're filled with the Spirit and they do what the Lord has instructed them to do. Now, that's another sermon for another day. But we see that David is indwelt. The Spirit of the Lord rushes upon David from that day forward. Samuel rises up. He goes to Ramah. He goes back home. And now the Spirit of the Lord departs from Saul, verse 14. So that's bad. I mean, we see that in contrast. David now has the Spirit of the Lord. It's not that there's not enough to go around. It's just that it's making very clear Saul is no longer king. David is the newly anointed king. He's the one that has the Spirit of the Lord upon him. The Spirit of the Lord departs from Saul. That's bad enough. That's not good at all, but it gets worse. It says, and a harmful spirit from the Lord tormented him. Now, yours may say evil spirit, depending on where that comes what translation you're looking at, but that Hebrew word for evil, it's got a range of meanings, just like our English words have a range of meanings. And so we hear evil spirit, and you might think, that sounds kind of sinful. What's going on there? But it seems like it's a good way of thinking of it, is that it's almost like an angel of judgment or spirit of judgment that's coming upon Saul, because God has rejected him. The kingdom is going to be torn from Saul. And so now there's this evil spirit, a harmful spirit, a spirit of judgment that's come upon him that is causing him to be in constant misery, constant sadness, sorrow. And so his servants notice this. It's not just something that impacts him inwardly. Everybody knows about it. Verse 15, Saul's servant said to him, "Look now, behold now, a harmful spirit from God is tormenting you. So let our Lord now command your servants who are before you to seek out a man who is skillful in playing the lyre," or playing the harp. "And when the harmful spirit from God is upon you, he will play it, and you will be well." So Saul said to his servants, "Look, provide for me this man who can play well, and bring him to me." And so, for whatever reason, they think, look, you get somebody playing the harp, that will soothe his spirit. And Saul is on board with this plan. And so one of his servants says, verse 18, "Look, behold, I have seen a son of Jesse, the Bethlehemite. And look at him, he's skillful in playing." Well, if you want to hear somebody play the harp, you want him to play it well. He's skillful in playing, but he's more than that. He's a man of valor. He's a man of war. He is prudent in speech and a man of good presence. Oh, and here's the best, the Lord is with him. Now that's very important. That's another big idea that we're going to see. We're about to get to chapter 17, the story of David and Goliath. We're going to spend most of our time there. We won't get into 18 tonight, but if we did, we would see that in 18 there are 3 different times where it's very clear that it says the Spirit of the Lord was with David. So bookending this story that we're about to get to, our famous story of David and Goliath, is this reminder on both sides of the story that God is with David. That's pretty important for us to keep in mind as we're studying the story of David and Goliath, is that the Lord is with David.
The Lord must be working on that servant also.
Yep. The Lord's working through that servant? Absolutely. Think about that. I mean, the fact that here's this unnamed servant, we don't know who he is, but we're talking about him 3,000 years later, and the Lord worked through him in this life of David and his interactions with Saul.
And you happen to know that Jesse had a son he played with.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we have no idea, how he had gotten that reputation. And it's hard to even imagine that David had gotten a reputation, so to speak, at that point, because again, he's young and he's out tending the sheep. When does he get to the big city? When do people get to know David, and how did they meet him? How did they learn this? We're just not told the details here. But through all of that, we see that God is working behind the scenes to bring all of this together.
Was this before he killed the lion with his bare hands?
Well, he's going to talk about that. So yeah, maybe word had gotten out about that in town. Yeah,
Famous.
absolutely.
David killed a lion with his bare hands?
Mm-hmm.
A lion and a bear?
Yep.
Was the bear part of it? I thought it was 2.
Yeah, we'll get to that in just a few minutes. So Saul hears about this young guy. He sounds too good to be true. Absolutely, send for him. Saul sends messengers to Jesse and says, "Send me David, your son, who is with the sheep." Now notice, Saul doesn't ask. He's the king. You remember what Samuel told them when they said they wanted a king? And he said, this is what he's going to be like. He's going to take. That's right. He's going to be a taker. And we're going to see that a few more times tonight. He is a taker. And so Jesse takes a donkey laden with bread and a skin of wine and a young goat, and he sends them by David, his son, to Saul. And David comes to Saul and enters his service. Saul loves him greatly, and he becomes his armor bearer. And Saul says to Jesse, "Let David remain in my service, for he has found favor in my sight." And whenever the harmful spirit from God was upon Saul, David took the lyre, the harp, and played it with his hand. And so Saul was refreshed and was well, and the harmful spirit departed from him. So it seems like this is not a one-off occasion. Saul has these harmful spirits often, repeatedly. When it happens, David begins to play the harp and soothe him. Yes?
In verse 23, and whenever the harmful spirit from God was upon Saul, David took the lyre and played it with his hand. So Saul was refreshed and was well, and the harmful spirit departed from him. this harmful spirit, if it's from God, like
How is he making it go away?
yeah, it's from God, but David just plays a harp and
Yeah. We don't understand how all that works, but God is using that. He's using David and using David playing the harp. It's also connecting David and Saul. They're building a relationship that we're going to see throughout the rest of 1 Samuel.
does right.
Well, that's a good point. Two big things I wanted to point out before we move on to chapter 17 is here in this section we see that David is very similar to Samuel because he's entering the center or the seat of power at a very young age. You remember Samuel did that. He went to serve in the temple of the Lord with Eli, and just as Samuel later replaced Eli, so is David going to replace Saul. And so there's some parallels going on here. But more than that, we see from right out of the gate, David's demonstrating from the very first verses of his mention here in the Bible, his loyalty, his faithfulness as a servant. He is serving Saul. He's blessing Saul in a way that no one else can. He's serving the king. And there's going to come a day when the king no longer appreciates it. And there's going to come a day when the king is going to try to kill David. And there are going to be people who say David tried to do harm to Saul. But from the very opening verses of us seeing David and Saul together, David is faithful and loyal to his master, and he's trusting all the consequences to the Lord. I love the way one writer said it. Any deterioration in the relationship between Saul and David would not be David's fault. He is being absolutely faithful to Saul from the very beginning.
Do you have any indication of his age at this point?
Of David's age? That's a really good question. So between 16 and 17, we're going to say he's less than the age of 20 because that would have been the age they entered military service, and he's not in military service in chapter 17. So he's young, but old enough to be out keeping the sheep and old enough to be doing these responsibilities. So he's, somewhere in that ballpark. It's hard to tell. I'm told that my grandfather had his own cattle at like age 5. So, everybody's different. He's a responsible young man, that's for sure.
I kind of wondered about, because when they described David initially, they
Mhm.
described him as a man of war.
Yeah.
He's young, not in the army.
Right.
How did they make that statement?
It is very interesting, and yet we are going to see his interaction with animals and that he has been brave and defeated animals, and so that very well could be what's going on there.
Yeah, the man of valor, I figured that out from the lion and bear
Mhm.
issue, but
Mhm.
man of war just...
Yeah, and war makes us think, soldier, he's been fighting in battle, and there may be a better way to say that doesn't give that connotation, but I'm not sure.
If somebody had come and tried to take the sheep or
Mhm.
something like that, he could have fought back. And
Absolutely, yeah.
These are my sheep. You're not getting
So in that time when you turn 20, you're pretty much automatically drafted, and that's it.
Well, I don't know if they were automatically drafted, but I don't think they would have drafted them before age 20, is what my understanding is. So we're about to see, remember David has 7 brothers, only 3 of them are in the battle, only 3 of them are in the service, and we don't know if that's the law, that you only had to give your 3 sons, even if you had more than 3, you only had to send 3, or if the other ones were too young, we're just not told. All right, so any other thoughts or questions on chapter 16 before we get into chapter 17?
My thought is about that man of war is that this servant, you an awful lot of insight.
Mm-hmm.
I bet God gave him the insight to explain, tell who David is going to be, or he is. I don't know who he's
Yeah.
already, but I'm talking about what he is potentially.
Well, absolutely. That's a very good insight.
We've not been a man of war yet. I mean, that we
Yeah. That's good insight. That very well could be. Yeah. That very well could be what's going on, that he's kind of forth-telling. This is the character of this young man, even though,
Prophet type.
yeah, that's very possible. All right, so chapter 17, we come to the familiar story. We all know the story of David and Goliath. You've probably heard it since you were young. It's one of the most familiar stories in the entire Bible. It's been popularized. It's been referenced in all sorts of ways. When Tom Sawyer in Mark Twain's book, when he was asked who were Jesus's first 2 disciples, Tom Sawyer said David and Goliath. And so that lets you know that even for, if you've read Tom Sawyer, he's a very illiterate and mischievous boy, and his thoughts are David and Goliath. That's the most familiar story that he's got. It's hard and challenging in its own ways because it's so familiar. Sometimes when we know a story so well, we think we know everything about it. It's hard to actually slow down, read the details, and it's sometimes hard to understand what it's there for. So you've all heard sermons on David and Goliath, I'm sure. And if we took the time to share testimonies of what you could remember, I will give you that caveat because I've heard sermons on David and Goliath, and I don't remember everything from them. But what you might remember as being the point of David and Goliath. Well, there's all throughout church history, there's lots of allegory related to David and Goliath. Allegory is when you make everything symbolic and you try to find hidden meaning in every little rock and tree that you find in the story. So, for example, one man in church history said that Jesse sent his son, and he sent him with 10 loaves of bread. We're going to see that. And he said in the same way, God sent his son, and he sent him with the 10 commandments of the law. Well, that doesn't have anything to do with the story. Well, some people would look and they would say, well, Saul has got this scaly armor. That's kind of the meaning of one of the words describing his armor. He's got this scaly armor. Well, that sure does sound a whole lot like a snake. And you know, God has been defeating snakes in the garden ever since Genesis chapter 3, and they'll make some connections there. It all sounds nice and good, and some of it can even be true. You could say true things and just get it from the wrong text. And so this is one of those examples of a text that has been abused a lot through the years. And so you may have heard this taught. This is a lesson on how for you to defeat the giants of your life. You've probably heard something related to that. Maybe you've heard the 5 stones represent the 5 spiritual disciplines of the Christian life, and you need to have these spiritual disciplines in your life. The problem is the preachers that preach that can't all agree on what the spiritual disciplines are. And that's partly because that's not the point of the text. That's not what's going on here.
You only need the first one.
Do what?
You only need the first one. Because the first stone did the trick. So the first
There you go. That's right. You just need the one discipline. You just got to make sure you get that one right. And so even people outside of church, we're wrestling with how to interpret it. What does the text really mean? But even outside of Christianity, people have heard the story of David and Goliath. There's been movies made about it. It's become just a part of our culture to say, a David and Goliath story is really about the underdog. It's about the little guy coming on and taking the big guy and defeating the big guy. Well, again, is that the point? We're going to see what's going on here. There was a book written about 15, 20 years ago by a man named Malcolm Gladwell, who's not a believer, and he said that the victory in the story of David and Goliath is all about the victory, about being enterprising and energetic and knowing your strengths and knowing the enemy's weaknesses. All right, so he didn't know the point before he wrote the book, and I would say he still doesn't know the point even now. Yes, Andrew?
Underdog beats big guy.
Mm-hmm.
Does that mean that sometime soon, state's going to be Alabama?
One day. There's always hope. And we probably have at some point in the past. Yeah.
Sometimes I think God has things set up such a way that only He can receive the glory for it.
Absolutely.
So, if it been a little guy against a little guy, you would, God,
Yeah.
I mean, truthfully, He shouldn't beat him.
Absolutely.
But, of course, that's David's relied on God to keep him back.
Absolutely. Don't teach the lesson now. You're doing too good. You're getting ahead of me. That. Yeah.
It's under
Fred does it.
all
First
things
Nick
are
always
possible through.
Yeah.
But that's what they say.
Yeah.
Nick always-
So, but think about that. You're getting at it. This is a story all about God. David and Goliath are characters in the story. The story is about glorifying God. He is the one who saves. He is the one who delivers. But how many times have we heard this taught or preached as if it is some manual, it's some pep talk on here's how to defeat all the giants of your life? I remember the last time I remember hearing a sermon on David and Goliath was the church we were at in Fort Worth when we first got there. And our sole criteria for choosing a church, again, it's Fort Worth, it's a big place. We were looking for something close because the last season of our life we'd been traveling a long way to church, and so we were looking for something close, and that didn't last very long. But I remember that summer, the pastor had a series called Bedtime Stories. That's the first tip-off that there's a problem. And he was telling you famous stories that we tell our children in the Bible, and he was trying to help you get the right meaning. And I remember he had this big old wooden, statue thing of Goliath to help you really envision this is how big Goliath is. And then he brings up a child to compare him to get the height, just to really help you understand the difference in the size. And now this may be my fault and not the preacher's fault. I don't remember anything else from the sermon. Now, again, I'm on this side of it, so I understand that could be my fault and not the preacher's fault. But his emphasis was on, look how big Goliath is, look how small you are, God can handle all that. And we treat it like it's this how-to manual. Follow these 5 steps, these 5 disciplines, these 5 stones, and if you do this, you can defeat any giant in your life. I don't think that's what's going on here. But to be sure, this is a very memorable story. And the writer of 1st and 2nd Samuel knows that he's got a very memorable story. There's several things I'd point out to you here at the beginning. Number one, it's longer than usual. You notice the chapter is long. It's long in Hebrew. It's over 900 words in Hebrew. He's got more quotations from characters. And we talk about how to handle a story just like you're watching a movie. You're watching the characters. You're watching the scenes develop. You're watching the setting. You're watching the plot as it moves along. There's quotations. There's 22 quotations here in the story. That's a lot. He gives lots of little details that would normally be left out of the story. So he gives us details about the armor. He goes into great detail about that. He gives us detail about the cheese and the bread, and he gives us details about when David went to gather the stones out of the brook, and he even tells us about when David removes his sword from his scabbard. All these are really, little things, but he's telling us because he knows he's got a story, and he's helping us to even slow down and think about it. And some of the things y'all have alluded to already, there's some tension between chapter 16 and chapter 17. There's some details that at first glance we think, now, are these contradicting one another? Because here in chapter 16, clearly David has met Saul. But at the end of chapter 17, it's almost like Saul has no clue who he is. And so we ask ourselves, what's going on here? I think the writer is telling us the story in such a way, even with that, to make us slow down and think about this story. There's times when the story just moves quickly, especially when it gets to the actual battle. The actual battle is just 2 or 3 verses. But there's other times when it's painstakingly slow. He's just giving you little detail by detail by detail. Just the way a good movie or a good book builds the story, that's exactly what's going on here. So there's definitely a lot for us to feast on here in the story of David and Goliath. So we get the setting here in the first 3 verses. Look at the setting here. It says, the Philistine gathered their armies for battle, and they gathered at Socoh, which belongs to Judah, and encamped between Socoh and Azekah and Ephes-dammim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered, and they encamped in the valley of Elah, and they drew up in line of battle against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on the mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side with a valley between them. So you get the picture. The Philistines, these age-old enemies that Israel has been fighting for a long time, all the way back since when they entered the Promised Land. And we've even seen them earlier in the book. Remember back in 1 Samuel 4 and 5 and 6 with Dagon, the Philistine god, and when the Philistines took the Ark of the Covenant, these are those same enemies. And here they are again, and they're in battle. And here they are lined up on one side, and Israel's lined up on the other side, and down between them, it says there's a valley between them, but we're going to get the bigger picture as it goes on. It seems like it's a wadi, or a dried up brook. It's where the water, where he would get the stones from. There's a brook in between them. And so here they are on both sides, and if either one of them start coming down, then they're exposing themselves to being ambushed, to being fought. They're making themselves vulnerable to come down, to cross over to the other side. So they're at a stalemate. This age-old enemy, and they're at a stalemate here. And we're going to start getting introduced to the characters of the story. And there have been many others before me that have noticed there's some similarities that we see and we're taught about Goliath, about Saul, about David. Some people would even point out David's oldest brother in the story. So there's some things we're going to see over and over. Like a good Baptist, I found a way to alliterate them. So there's three things we're going to look at these characters. We're going to see their stature or their size. We're going to see their supplies, and we're going to see their skills or their expertise. So we're going to examine that on these characters as we work our way through the story. Their stature, their supplies, and their skills. So right out of the gate, we are introduced to Goliath. It's almost as if the writer is looking forward into the future, and he's saying, now in this corner stands Goliath, the champion of Gath, and his height was 6 cubits and a span. He's 9 feet 9 inches tall. He is truly a giant. We get the wow factor right out of the gate. We're looking at this giant of a man named Goliath. Now, in their day, I'm told that the average Jewish man, the average Israelite man, perhaps just the average man in general, was about 5 feet to maybe 5.5 feet. So even I'm tall compared to the men of that day. Now, y'all know I'm not tall by today's standards. I wanted to be tall growing up. Everybody else in my family, and my dad, on my mom's side of the family, they were all, like the back row here, they were 6'6", and I just thought surely I would get up to that at some point, and I never did. And it just, my father was short, and so it balanced out. But this is a tall man, and he's taller even by the standards of that day. He's a giant by the standards of that day. He's almost twice as big as everybody else in that day. So when we look at his stature, his size, he's a giant. Well, what about his supplies, his resources? We get that here in verses 5 through 7. Look at that. He had a helmet of bronze on his head. He was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. That's about 126 pounds. The weight of his armor, his coat, is about 126 pounds. He has bronze armor on his legs. He has a javelin of bronze slung back between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and the spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron. That's about 15 pounds just for the head of the spear. And he's also got a shield bearer who goes before him to help him with all of these things. So you see Goliath, and he has got this massive, intimidating armor on. This is not normal armor for that day in those standards. He's kind of special. He's set apart. He's going to be the tank going out in front of them. He has got this intimidating armor. And the Israelites, on the other hand, we've seen them in battle. They're pretty much just wearing regular clothes. They don't have special armor. But now to be sure, Goliath's armor, it's really clunky. It's made more to intimidate than it is to be functional. He's going to be moving slow while David is moving fast. But he definitely has this intimidating factor, this intimidating armor. He's got the wow factor going on. So we've seen the stature and his supplies, but what about his skills? We're told over in the story in verse 33 that he was a man of war even from his youth. So Goliath has been fighting a long time. He's a skilled fighter. He's a man's man, and he's looking for a man to come out. He keeps taunting them, as we're going to see. He's looking, is there anybody in Israel man enough to take me on? He's throwing down the gauntlet, and he appears to be invincible. But what verse did I tell you to keep thinking about? Chapter 16, verse 7. Man looks at the outward appearance, but God looks at the heart. By outward appearances, Goliath is undefeatable. Nobody can beat Goliath. It is not looking good. Well, not only is he dressed for battle and is he an intimidating soldier, but he's taunting the army of God. Look at verse 8. It says that that's Goliath, stood and he shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? If you're not willing to fight, why are you standing out here acting like you're willing to fight? You're all out there. You look like you're ready to go." But then he says, "Am I not a Philistine? And are you not servants of Saul?" And here he starts talking about something we could call representative combat. Look how he explains it to them. He says, "Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. And if he's able to fight with me and kill me, then he will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." So he's basically saying, look, instead of both armies getting beat up and bloody and, people are going to die, let's cut down on the casualties. Let's just have one-on-one. Let's have a representative. And Goliath says, I will represent the Philistines. And you send out somebody from Israel. You work for Saul. You're fighting for Saul. Send somebody out from Saul's army and just let the two of us fight. And if I win, you will serve us. But if you win, we will serve you. Now, there's more than just battle and subjection and slavery going on here, because that idea of serving, think about some of the passages of Scripture about Joshua speaking to Israel saying, choose you this day whom you will serve, but as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. The idea of service is not just slavery, it's also worship, because in their understanding of war, this is theological war. This is their God against the God of Israel. And we've seen the God of the Philistines. Remember, we saw him back in chapter 4, 5, and 6. We saw Dagon. And the last time we saw the statue of Dagon, he wasn't looking too good. But Goliath doesn't care because he believes his God is on his side. And he's ready to fight Israel, and he knows that this means he's fighting the God of Israel. And so if Israel loses, that essentially means they're rebelling against their God. They're not going to worship Yahweh anymore, and they're going to worship the Philistine God. So there's a lot on the line here. And so they say, choose a man for yourselves. Can you imagine what they're thinking? We did that already. You remember that? They wanted a king like the nations. They chose a man for themselves. They chose Saul. And what was he supposed to do? He was supposed to go out and fight their battles for them. So let's think about Saul for just a second, using that same criteria of his size and his supplies and his skills. Well, think about Saul's size or his stature. Do you remember how tall he is? Maybe not in inches, but how was he described? He was He's a head taller than everybody else in Israel. He was handsome. He was good looking. He was rich. He had it made. Saul is tall. Just like if anybody else should be going against Goliath, it should be Saul.
But here in this circumstances, they're not really, they're looking for a warrior to go out, but this is a sacrifice against the big guy.
Yeah. That's why nobody wants to go. But if you're looking by outward appearances, who should go? Should it be the 5'0" guy, or should it be the one who's head and shoulders taller than everybody else? The one who is supposed to go out and fight the battles for them, the one who has successfully led them in battle before. Saul has done it before. It's time for him to do it again. He's got the right stature, the right size, but what about his supplies? We saw all about Goliath's armor and everything that he's got going on. But do you remember back in a previous battle, back in chapter 13, I believe, it said that, remember, the enemy had taken over, they had monopolized the blacksmith market. And it said that nobody could come and get their tools worked on. And so Israel didn't have any weapons. The only place you could find a sword or a spear was with the royal family. Saul and his son Jonathan, they had the weapons. So if anybody in Israel has got a chance, it's going to be Saul. He's the one that should have the right supplies and the right resources. Well, that third category, his skills or his experience. Is Saul skilled or experienced enough to fight against Goliath? Well, here in verse 10, when it talks about Goliath says, I defy the ranks of Israel this day. We might run right by that word, defy, but the last time we saw a defiance was back, it reminded us back with Saul's victory over Nahash the Ammonite. And that was the guy who said, look, if you want to avoid battle, that's fine. We're just going to gouge out your right eyes and you're going to be servants to us for the rest of your lives. And Saul led the people. Remember, he took his own oxen. This was when he's anointed king. He takes his own oxen, he cuts them up into pieces, and he sends them around, and he says, if you don't come out and join me in battle, your oxen are going to look like this. And so you understand, he got a good army. Everybody came out. And Saul led them in battle to defeat Nahash the Ammonite. That was someone who defied the army of God. So, yeah, so this is the last time we saw. Saul was doing a good job. He's led the people in battle before. It's time for him to do it again. By outward appearances, Saul's the guy. But remember, man looks on the outward appearances, but God looks on the heart. All right?
Also, he's probably, the Spirit of God has left him, so he's probably on his own strength.
Absolutely. Oh, yeah. He would not be in good shape if he actually went to battle. But we understand, and we're going to see in the story, he doesn't want to go to battle. not one bit.
Very old. He's gotten wise now.
Well, something like that. So the Philistine said, I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. Remember, he's looking, is anybody man enough in Israel to take on Saul? And when Saul and all Israel heard the words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and they were greatly afraid. So his armor, it's doing the trick. Everybody's intimidated. Nobody wants to mess with Goliath. They're all afraid and they've forgotten what God has told them to do. Ever since God has been bringing them into the promised land, He's been telling them, don't be afraid. I am the Lord your God. I will go before you. I will fight your battles for you. They shouldn't be afraid, but they are. Why? Because man looks on the outward appearances, but God looks on the heart. Well, there's the first 11 verses. Let's see. Yeah, we got to keep moving. But you look here in verse 12, verses 12 through 23, it shifts to David. We get a lot more information, but the story doesn't necessarily move forward. All right, so let's see how that works out. 12, we're introduced to David all over again. David was the son of an Ephrathite of Bethlehem in Judah named Jesse, who had 8 sons. And in the days of Saul, the man was already old and he was advanced in years. That means Jesse is exempt from service. So he doesn't have to go out and fight himself, but his 3 oldest sons of Jesse have followed Saul to the battle. They followed. The names of the 3 sons who went to the battle were Eliab, the firstborn, next to him Abinadab, and the third Shammah. Now we've heard their names already. The rest of the sons aren't even mentioned. But we're told David was the youngest, and the 3 eldest followed Saul. All right, so notice it says followed, went, followed. These boys are going forth to battle. And one writer that I read, he even he took those 3 criteria and he asked about Eliab, because Eliab, the oldest brother, again, the oldest is the one who gets the most recognition. When Samuel saw the oldest brother, he said, oh, that's got to be the one. So he's got something resembling the appearance, and he's in the army, so he's in better shape than David is, and he gets very rude toward David, we're going to see in a little bit. And so because he's saying, you're a youth, you shouldn't be out here in battle, leave it to us professionals. And so in one sense, even within his own family, David is not the one you should be looking at. You would think, oh, Eliab, he's the oldest, he's probably the biggest, he's the one that might be the best from Jesse's family, but that's not how it shakes out.
They're the older brothers trying to hit their youngest brother in the first place.
Yeah.
You're just a kid. You go back and play with sheep.
Yeah. Does that remind you of any other brothers in the Bible that we have the older brothers all ganging up on the youngest brother? Joseph. Yep. That's another rabbit to trace another night. But there's some similarities there between them. But notice again, what is the 3 eldest followed Saul? Who is Saul? Saul is a taker. He's taking the sons off to war, just like Samuel told him that he would do. But David went back and forth from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. So when we ended chapter 16, David is serving in the house of Saul. And so we don't know how much time has passed between 16 and 17. Perhaps David's getting a little bit older. He might be shaping up, maturing a little bit more, but he's still probably not 20 because he's not drafted into the army. But that's going to help make sense of some stuff at the end, because if he looks a little different, if he's a growing boy, that would help make sense of why Saul doesn't seem to recognize him at a few points along the way. And so perhaps because the 3 oldest brothers are off helping Saul at war, Saul says, sure, you can go back and forth and help your father. However it works out, David is back and forth taking care of his father's sheep at Bethlehem. And don't miss verse 16. For 40 days the Philistine came forward and took his stand, morning and evening. 80 times at least, Goliath comes out and he's taunting the people of God.
You camped on these 2 hills looking down in the valley for
Yeah.
40 days.
And the natural acoustics of all that, they're talking back and forth just like you and I are talking back and forth.
And everybody's got to be tense because they're watching, if anybody starts down that mountain,
Yeah.
they're coming at us.
And if you're trying to pay the bill of a war, every day that it goes on, is the more it's costing. And so this is not good for Israel at all, but they're at a stalemate. They're terrified. They don't know what to do. Did you have something, Fred?
I've been blessed to be there.
Uh-huh.
We stood on the hill that the Philistines on, looking back over Jerusalem.
Yeah.
And you see the valley, the stream is still there.
Mm-hmm.
And they had to be standing over there where the city's going to be built.
Right.
You know, it's not had been built yet.
Right.
And they're on that hill Jerusalem.
Yeah.
On that side, looking back. I mean, that's exactly what it looks.
Yeah. Well, look, if you can get your bride to make an itinerary and get us all a trip over there, I would love to go see that. I know. I think she's probably the one who's most up to that challenge of figuring out a way to get us all over. So, but you see they're at a standoff. We kind of forget about it. I hadn't really thought about the fact it says this is going on for 40 days. And so Jesse says to David his son, "Take for your brothers an ephah of this parched grain and take 10 loaves. Carry them quickly to the camp of your brothers. Go take them some food so they have something to eat. Take these 10 cheeses to the commander of their 1,000. It's a good thing to make sure that your son's commanding officer likes your sons if he's having to choose who he's putting on the front lines. And so Daddy is making sure that the boys have what they need at war, making sure that the commanding officer has something to keep him happy while they're at war. And he also wants to know if his sons are well. He says, see if your brothers are well and bring some token from them. The token may have been some form of payment, or it could just be a sign, hey, your sons are all right. Here's some physical proof to know your boys are still alive. And so David does that, and while all this is going on, verse 19 says, Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah fighting with the Philistines. It's like the narrator just keeps reminding you, hey, this is going on. It's going on for 40 days. So
They're not in battle.
I know, but you look, it's like they're putting on an act here because every day it seems like they all line up. They're acting like they're getting ready to fight, and it's almost like, all right, you first. No, you first. All right, who's going to go first?
It's all, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
But it's all building up. God's orchestrating,
Oh, yeah, yeah.
All this stuff. He's posing all this for that moment.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. And that's the point. As you're reading it, you should feel that tension building the same way that you do with a movie. A movie is our standard form of entertainment today, and we understand that. But you can get that same thing from a book, from a story, and that's what this storyteller is doing. He's helping you build the tension. You're getting ready for the showdown that's coming. But look at David here. Verse 20, it says, David rose early in the morning. He left the sheep with a keeper. He left him with a shepherd and took the provisions and went as Jesse had commanded him. Look at David being a good shepherd. And he came to the encampment as the host was going out to the battle line, shouting the war cry. Israel and the Philistines, they draw up for battle, army against army. It's like they do this act every day. And David leaves the things in charge of the keeper of the baggage, and he runs to the ranks, and he goes and he greets his brothers. And as he talked with them, oh look, there he is, standing in this corner, weighing in, or measuring in at 9 feet 9, the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name. There's this tension building. It's like, don't forget, there's this giant over here, and he's the enemy of Israel. He comes out of the ranks of the Philistines, and he spoke the same words as before. But it says, David heard them. Now, we don't know David's life. We're not told everything before this point, but I wonder if this is the first time David has ever heard God ridiculed. Is this the first time he's experienced his God being mocked and scoffed? And David hears everything that Goliath is saying. But we've gotten all this information, but verse 24, we really haven't moved forward in the story. We're right back where we were at verse 11, because all the men of Israel, when they see this man, they flee from him, and they were very much afraid. And remember, when they're fleeing away from their faithfulness to God, they're essentially fleeing right into the arms of Dagon, the Philistine god. They're not being faithful to what God has told them to do. Here in verse 25, the men of Israel, the soldiers, they're talking to themselves, and they're saying, have you seen this man who's come up? Surely he's come up to defy Israel. But listen, did you hear the king? The king has gotten word about Goliath's one-on-one battle, this opportunity to have representative combat. And Saul, the king, is ready to take him up on it, but Saul's not the one going out to battle. He's a coward. He's not going to do it. But he is willing to cut a very generous deal to any soldier who's willing to take on Goliath. Look, he says 3 things here. I will give him great riches, I will give him my daughter, and I will give his father's house no taxes for the rest of their life in Israel. He's got it made. All you got to do is go kill this 9'9" giant. That's all that's standing between you and no taxes on your house the rest of your life, great riches, and you get to marry the king's daughter. And no matter what she looks like, it doesn't matter because you're getting access into the power and the privilege of being in the royal family. This is a deal that nobody could pass up if it weren't for the fact of that 9-foot-tall giant out there. That makes a big hindrance to everybody. But you hear the soldiers, they're talking to one another. They're talking about this deal that Saul is offering to everybody. But now David has come up. And David didn't hear all that, so he says to the men who stood by him, "What is going to be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine?" Remember, that means he ain't part of God's family. He's not part of the covenant. All you Israel soldiers, you are part of God's covenant. But this uncircumcised Philistine, what's going to be done about this one who defies the armies of the living God? And the people answer him the same way. They tell him, "Here's what Saul has said, so shall it be done to the man who kills him." All right, so we keep moving. Verse 28, we see Eliab. Again, we've talked about Eliab. He might measure up, but no, not really. His oldest brother hears about this when he speaks to the men, and Eliab's anger is kindled against David. And he gets mad at him like older brothers tend to do. And he says, "Why have you come down here? Who did you leave taking care of those few sheep back in the wilderness? I know the presumption and the evil of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle." Big brother sees David and he lets him have it. But remember, Samuel saw Eliab and he thought, "Hey, this has got to be the one." Well, now we're vindicated. We understand this ain't him. He is no better of a judge of character than anybody else is in the story. Eliab misjudges David. And David's kind of like, "Hey, what have I done now? I was just asking you a question." And so David turns away from him towards another, speaks in the same way, and so the people answered before. So David's just kind of going around to the different soldiers, and it's almost like you can imagine him being incredulous. You heard everything that Saul has offered, but more than that, you know that this Goliath is ridiculing the God of Israel. Why are you still standing here? And so David, he's done. He doesn't want to hear any more from Goliath. So verse 31, when the words that David spoke were heard, they repeated them before Saul, and he sent for him. David said to Saul, "Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine." Now again, this is one of those places where Saul and David are talking, and we don't seem to have a lot of recognition here, and you just kind of wonder what's going on in the situation. But regardless, Saul says to David, "No, you are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth." Now when the king says no, that should be the end of the conversation, but not with David. David pleads his case. He has more to say. Look, verse 34, David said to Saul, "Look, your servant used to keep sheep for his father. And when there was a lion or a bear and it came and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and I struck him and I delivered it out of his mouth. And if he arose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him." I don't know exactly what age David is at this point. I don't know how tall he is. I don't know how much muscle he has. I just know I don't want to mess with him because he's clearly able to handle himself. And David is pleading his case with Saul. He says, "Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine, he's no better. He will be just like one of them, he who has defied the armies of the living God. This Goliath, even though he's big, he's no better than an animal. The Lord has delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, and he will deliver me from the paw of this Philistine." Well, Saul hears that. He says, "All right, go, and may the Lord be with you."
Get it done.
Absolutely. And so here we have something interesting, again, just extra details that the storyteller tells us. He says, Saul clothed David with his armor, which is an ironic thing because in one sense, that's what you would do to the new king. He's giving the king's armor away. And we know that the kingdom is being taken away from Saul. David is going to be king. He's already been anointed as king. But of course, Saul doesn't realize that. But it's a bit of irony. He puts his armor on David. He puts the helmet of bronze on his head, and he's clothed with a coat of mail. And notice again, he's got the armor. So he should have been the guy going out against Goliath, the one with the armor. But Saul didn't want to go. And so David straps his sword over his armor. Again, just little details. And he tries in vain to go, for he had not tested them. He tries to put on Saul's armor, and he can't move. I mean, think back to when your children are small and they wear your grown man boots. They can't walk in them. They fall over. And so children do that. That's what David looks like. He's wearing somebody else's armor. And so David says to Saul, I can't go with these. I haven't tested these. So David put them off. He took them off. Again, perhaps a subtle reminder that David's not going to be a king like Saul. He's rejecting Saul's ways. He's not going to be like Saul. So what does he take? He takes his staff in his hand, and he chooses 5 smooth stones from the brook, and he puts them in the shepherd's pouch. Now, there's a lot more we could go into about how they're trusting in their weapons, but all of the weapons that are intimidating the people of Israel, those are all man-made weapons. David is going out with God-made weapons. He's going out with a stick and rocks.
He's
Yes.
doing that with a blessing.
Yes,
There in the latter part of 37. Go and the Lord be with you.
absolutely. And this is one of Saul's better moments because he's actually using God's name correctly. Remember, Saul has not shown himself to be someone with deep theological understanding, but here he sends David out with the blessing of the Lord. So David's geared up. He's moving toward the Philistine. Verse 41, the Philistine. Notice it doesn't say Goliath. It keeps referring to him as the Philistine. That guy who's not part of us, that enemy, the Philistine. He's moving forward, but to be certain, he's moving forward clumsily with this bulky armor. And he comes near to David with his shield bearer in front of him. And when the Philistine looked and saw David. Now stop right there. You can't pass that up because it says, looked and saw. Remember the verse? Man looks on the outer appearances, but God sees, God looks on the heart. Well, Goliath looks and sees David, and he disdains him. He's in disgust because David is no competition for him. He says, this is a youth, he's ready and he's handsome in appearance. Who is this kid coming out to fight me? And the Philistine says to David, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? Sticks are something you do to shoo away dogs, to beat off dogs. You come out to me, Goliath, the great warrior, the champion, as if I'm merely a dog. And the Philistine curses David by his gods. Again, this is theological warfare. Goliath is trusting in Dagon. David is trusting in Yahweh, the God of Israel. But the rest of Israel, they're not trusting in God a whole lot right now. Well, the Philistine, Goliath says to David, look, you come here to me, you little kid, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field. He's saying, I'm going to kill you, and you're not going to be buried. You're going to be food for the vultures. You're going to have dishonorable decay. Your body's going to be left out to rot and to be eaten. Now, this is dishonorable in any culture, but it's certainly dishonorable in the Jewish culture. Now, David's turn to talk. Verse 45, then David said to the Philistine, you have come to me with a sword and a spear and a javelin, but I come to you with a sling and stones. Is that what he says?
Nope.
Not at all. He says, you come to me with a sword, a spear, and a javelin, 1, 2, 3, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied, 1, 2, 3. David is willing to meet Goliath head for head on everything that Goliath brings to the table, but he comes with the name of the Lord. His weapons are God. He's not trusting in anything else except the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel. There's that word, Lord Sabaoth. I like to point that out to you often. That's the Hebrew, but we sing it in A Mighty Fortress Is Our God. Lord Sabaoth, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. But David's not done. He says, this day the Lord will, not might, this day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head, and I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and He will give you into our hand. Everything that Goliath thinks that he's going to do to David, David says, oh no, it's coming for you. The Lord is going to defeat you, and it's not just me and you out here, Goliath. Everyone is going to know that there is a God in Israel, and He's stronger than the God of the Philistines. He's stronger than any other God. And all this assembly will know that the Lord, Yahweh, saves not with sword and spear. The battle is the Lord's. But now we actually get the battle, and it's just a couple of verses. Verse 48, the showdown is upon us. When the Philistine arose, he came and he drew near to meet David. But again, he's not moving fast with all that armor on. David runs quickly toward the battle. Where's the rest of Israel? They're running away from the battle. David's running towards the battle to meet the Philistine. And David puts his hand in his bag. He takes out a stone. He slings it. He strikes the Philistine on his forehead. And the stone sank into his forehead. And he fell on his face to the ground. The battle's over. We've been building up for 47 verses just to get to these two short verses. 40 days, all these verses, it's been going a long time, and it's over just like that. That's what's so interesting. So many times in the Bible, there's a build-up to these big things, these big battles, and it's over just like that because it's God. He doesn't need a lot of time. He just speaks, and it's that way. We think about it again, Revelation 19, when Christ returns, He just speaks, and the battle is over. All right? So you get the summary in verse 50. David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and he struck the Philistine and killed him. Now there was no sword in the hand of David. He didn't kill him with a sword. He killed him with the sling and with the stone. But he does go get a sword. David ran. He stood over the Philistine, and he took his sword, that is the Philistine, Goliath's sword, and he drew it out of its sheath, and he killed him, and he cut off his head with it. Now, I keep going back to Dagon, back in chapter 4 and 5. Dagon, the god of the Philistines, the last time we saw him, he had fallen over and his head was cut off. And now Goliath has met the same fate. Goliath wrongly put his trust in the god of the Philistines, and he has met the same fate. And when the Philistines saw that their champion, their hero, their deliverer was dead, they fled. They ran. And so now the men of Israel and Judah, they rise with a shout. They pursued the Philistines as far as Gath and the gates of Ekron, so that the wounded Philistines fell on the way from Sha'arim as far as Gath and Ekron. And the people of Israel came back from chasing the Philistines, and then they plundered their camp. And David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his tent. There's a lot going on there. Number one, we see David has had a tent because, again, he's going back and forth from Bethlehem and he's going to battle and there's lots going on, so he's put up a tent there. But he takes Goliath's head to Jerusalem, but Jerusalem was not Jerusalem at that point. It was not the holy city at that point. They did not occupy Jerusalem at that point. The enemy, foreigners, had Jerusalem. And so at least part of this seems to be that David is putting them on notice. He's already acting like a king. He's fighting for the people in battle, and he's letting the enemy know that we're coming, not because David's so great, but because he's going to obey God. And we're going to see that God gives them the city of Jerusalem. But look at verses 55 and 56. You get a little bit of a flashback here in the battle. That seems to be what's going on. Back earlier in the battle, when Saul saw David go out against the Philistine, he says to Abner, the commander of the army, "Abner, whose son is this youth?" Now, at first we think he's saying, well, who is that kid? We don't know who that is. Maybe he's saying that, but he has met David. But he's specifically asking, whose son is he? Because he's thinking in his mind, perhaps, hey, I'm about to not get taxes from that man's family anymore because he's going out to battle, and I've promised him that his family will not pay taxes anymore. So he's asking, whose son is this? Whose family does he belong to? And Abner, who's the commander of the army, doesn't even know. That's how little of an impact David has made at this point. Abner says, as your soul lives, O king, I do not know. Now, that's earlier in the battle as they're watching David go out. But now, verse 50, he tells Abner to find out, inquire whose son the boy is. And now 57, as soon as David returned from the striking down of the Philistine, Abner took him, and he brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. And Saul said to him, whose son are you, young man? So again, remember the free taxes. Remember the fact maybe it's been a while since Saul has, maybe he's just not putting it all together. It doesn't quite make sense to us because he just tried to give him the armor. But remember also, Saul doesn't have the Spirit of the Lord anymore. And before Saul had the Spirit of the Lord, do you remember how stupid Saul was? He was out there chasing donkeys and he couldn't find them. You know, big, loud, noisy donkeys, and he couldn't find them. He wandered around for days to the point that his family was more worried that he had died. They weren't worried about the donkeys anymore. Perhaps, maybe the Lord will correct me one day, but perhaps Saul is just stupid and he doesn't understand any of this because he no longer has the Spirit of the Lord. He's working in his own senses, and it's not good. Saul is nothing without the Lord. And so David answers and says, I'm the son of your servant Jesse the Bethlehemite.
This is far out, but it's sort of like they didn't recognize Jesus when he came for his own people didn't recognize him. And when he was around Saul might have, he probably wasn't paying attention who was there, but they brought in somebody to play this instrument. And he probably just, didn't give it a second thought.
That's very true. He very well may not have had. There's a lot that goes into that. Absolutely. Yeah.
What's going on here now? It says in 54, David took the Philistines' head and brought it to Jerusalem. He put the Philistines' weapons in his own tent. Okay, then you get down to 57. As soon as David returned from killing the Philistine, he took him before Saul with David still holding the Philistine's head.
But he's asking because if it tells us in 54 he takes the head to Jerusalem, but now in 57 he's coming back before Saul. I'm sorry.
So he left the head at Jerusalem.
Well, there's that. He could have taken and come back. I'm not sure how long that trip would have been. But it seems to be that these verses are kind of like the epilogue.
He got his trophy and he ain't letting go.
Yeah, kind of like a troll head. He's just carrying it
When he
around.
went and
But
got him, see, he brought him to Saul, so
I know, he put
he
his
wanted to bring it
weapons
to Saul
in
to show
his
it to him.
tent.
He could
Yeah.
have been that reason why he kept it with him.
Yeah.
He may have took it one place, and when Abner, whatever, come and found him.
That's true. So there's lots of possibilities of it. It seems like part of it could be the fact that this is kind of like the last scene of the movie, the epilogue, the appendix in the book. And so the story ends, David has taken it to Jerusalem. But, oh yeah, by the way, when he was coming back from battle, Saul was so clueless he didn't know who David was. And so Saul brought David before him. So it's extra information there, but it's not meant to be a contradiction. Yes, Andrew?
How much did the head weigh?
I have no idea.
Pound and a half.
Raven played about that.
I tell you what, it's heavy.
You're back here on the back row, you don't like it.
With that rock sticking in it, it probably weighed a little bit more.
Oh, me. Well, look, we have,
I'm sure it's still
technically 2 minutes, and I hear the ladies already knocking doors over there. They're getting done. I do have one more thing to say, but do you have any other questions or comments before we conclude? When we get back together in the spring or in January, chapter 18 kind of continues the story. And this is one of those places where the chapter divisions may not serve us very well, but the chapter's gone on long enough. But there is there is more to the story, and even as I mentioned earlier, there's these connections all the way through 16, 17, and 18. The Lord is with David. But the question, we've tried to explain the story and live the story, but what's the point? Why is this story here? Well, again, it's a very vivid example. Number one, the Lord is with David. He's not with Saul anymore. It's a living testimony that man looks on outward appearances, but the Lord looks on the heart. David is a wonderful example of faith, of how he's trusting in the Lord God, that God will deliver him. David is not the hero of the story. The only reason we should be looking to David in any admirable way is because he points us to the God of Israel, and he reminds us we should have faith in him, but not faith in David. Yes?
But that's the way, to me, it's always been. It was David was the big hero of the whole story. And
Absolutely.
I bet there's a lot of people that don't even, don't realize that.
Right. Well, that's the problem when we teach it that way, is be more like David, be more like David. Especially, look, this is another tangent that I don't have time for, but this is one of those stories that we teach children at a young age, and we say, be like David, be like David. Well, that's great in chapter 17, but when you get to 2 Samuel and David's caught in adultery, what do you do at that point? We've taught them, be like David. No, they need to look to God, the God that David trusted, the God that David repented to, even when David sinned. And Fred kind of took away a little bit of what I was going to say there. He started pointing us to Christ. I think sometimes people with allegory, they overdo it, and they want to see something related to Jesus under every rock and tree, and they overdo it. But certainly, we don't want to miss the fact that David is pointing us to Christ. Only David can do anything like this because of what Christ has done. And so, with this representative combat, this one man standing in the place of the whole nation, there is one man who has stood in place of the entire human race, and that is Jesus Christ. And He is the only mediator between God and man. And so we don't want to miss the fact that this does give us a good example of faith, but the faith is to be directed towards Christ and what He has done, and the God who delivers His people Israel.